Okay, welcome back to Apologetics. We'll jump right into the class outline. We've moved down now to this second section where we're presenting a case that Jesus is God. Good reasons and evidence to believe that Jesus is God. We're not going to do any review this week because we've got a lot of material to cover tonight, so we're just going to jump right into it. So zooming into this section, this is where we're at in this section. So tonight we're going to be looking at reasons to believe that the New Testament authors told the truth. And we're going to see 6 reasons to believe that when the New Testament authors wrote down their accounts, we're going to call them testimonies, wrote down their testimonies, they in fact were telling the truth. Why do we believe that? What are some good reasons to believe they were telling the truth? Now, the method we're going to be used is the same method that historians use, as well as detectives, lawyers, and judges in like a courtroom setting. So if you can imagine in a courtroom setting, all of those individuals, detectives, lawyers, judges, they're trying to figure out if potential eyewitnesses are really telling the truth. People who claim to be eyewitnesses, and then those folks in the courtroom are trying to determine, ascertain, whether those eyewitnesses are really telling the truth. We're going to use some of the same methods that those folks use in a courtroom, as well as methods that are used by historians, similar methods. I'm not claiming, I always have to give this kind of a precondition at a time, so you understand, I'm not claiming that we can prove with absolute certainty that the New Testament authors told the truth. But as you well know, I don't think we can achieve absolute certainty in anything. So what we're left with any of our beliefs and choices in life is, do we have good reasons and evidence for it? Can we build a good case that they were telling the truth? Eyewitness testimony doesn't prove something with absolute certainty. Life just doesn't work that way. But, lawyers, detectives, judges, historians know that if they look for certain things and if they find certain things from eyewitnesses, then it's more likely that they're telling the truth. So just think about it for a moment. Put yourself in that frame of mind that you're a detective and you're trying to figure out what happened. Maybe it's a crime scene, maybe it's a murder scene, and you're interviewing people and trying to figure out what really happened. Now you can imagine there are folks who would want to lie about that, maybe to protect someone or to cause someone to be found guilty when they're really not. So what would you think, what type of things would cause you to conclude that a particular eyewitness is telling the truth or inventing lies? And I think as we process through that and have talked to detectives and attorneys and those who work in this field, I think you'll come to some similar conclusions as to why you should trust someone. Well, we're going to look at 6 of these, as I said tonight, 6 reasons to believe that an eyewitness, in this case, the authors of the New Testament, were really telling the truth. The first one is that they gave their testimony, their account, their story, if you will. They gave their testimony soon after the events took place. Now that's helpful. I think we would agree to that. Secondly, their testimonies include many accurate historical facts that we know from other sources. That's helpful. Number 3, their testimonies are confirmed by other non-Christian historical sources. So there's some corroboration here. And I think that's helps make a good case that they were telling the truth. Number 4, their testimonies include details that make them look bad. And that one's interesting, and I think we'll have some fun with that. Number 5, there are differences between their accounts, their testimonies, but these differences are small and reconcilable. And we'll talk more about what that means, of course. Number 6, the 6th reason to believe the New Testament authors were telling the truth is that they were willing to suffer and die for their testimonies. So let's just go through them in order, all 6 of these. Start with the first one, the fact that they gave their testimony soon after the events that they discussed and told us about took place. To set this up, think about this question for just a moment. Which of these Georges is more mythable. In other words, let's say if you were going to write biographies about these two Georges, two of our past presidents of America, if you were going to write biographies of these two Georges, in which one would it be easier for you to make up myth or to tell a lie? Well, of course, it would be easier for you to make up a legend about George Washington because it's farther away. We're farther away in history from when he lived, and it would be harder to disprove your lie, right? I mean, if you tried to make up a myth or a legend about George Bush, people could more easily debunk that. I mean, they could, in one sense, they could just go ask George Bush, well, is this actually true? Did you really do or say these things? Or, you know, there's other eyewitnesses that are still alive, so on and so forth. So you get the idea. The longer a testimony is given, or the longer amount of time after an event that a testimony is given, the less likely that it's true, all else being equal. Plus, just, you know, it's possible to forget things the more time goes by, right? So not even a mistaken, or not even a purposeful lie, but just a mistaken information is more easily slipped in the more time goes by. Okay, so thinking through then these miracle accounts of Jesus, because that's what we're getting at, right? What Jesus said and did he really do these miracles? Were the New Testament authors telling the truth when they talked about Jesus' claim to be God, and were they telling the truth about the miracles that he supposedly performed, in particular his resurrection? You know that some people claim that these miracles and his resurrection and his claim to be God was a myth that grew up much, much later. Some people even say hundreds of years later that grew up into a myth. So, is there any historical evidence that would help us to see how soon after the events of Jesus' ministry were the disciples making these claims about his miracles and his resurrection? Is this something that rose up decades, centuries later, or were Jesus' disciples making some of these claims very soon after the fact? That's what we're evaluating. To start, let's look at the timeline of when the New Testament books were written. And so just to kind of set up the broad parameters of our timeline, I put two things on here that virtually everybody agrees with, Christian, non-Christian. Everybody agrees that the Jesus of history, Jesus of Nazareth, performed his, or did his ministry, had his 3 to 4 years of ministry in the early 30s, AD, of course. The second event that kind of helps us have a little bit of parameter here, just some beginning of a timeline, is the destruction of the temple in AD 70. This is a huge event in the life of Israel, when the Romans came in and destroyed Jerusalem and their temple, which they had worshipped in for centuries. So we'll start with these two things, and there is good evidence that the New Testament was finished by AD 100. You might remember we looked at some of this evidence last time, I believe, because by AD 100 you have early church leaders, we call the church fathers, who are quoting the New Testament. And if you're quoting something, then by definition, that thing must already exist for you to quote it. So there's a good case to be made that the entire New Testament was completed by AD 100 because people at that time are starting to quote it in their devotional books, letters, hymn books, so on and so forth. There's also a good argument that can be made that most of the New Testament, if not possibly all of it, was written before AD 70 even. So written before this huge event when the temple was destroyed. How could we go ahead and make that argument? Well, if you read through the New Testament, the narrative books in particular talk as though the temple is still there. In other words, the destruction of the temple is not mentioned at all throughout the New Testament. And the narrative seems to take place, and it's described that the temple is still around and everything's fine with Jerusalem and the temple. Now think about this for a moment. If, let's say next year, in 2022, some other country invaded America and destroyed Washington, D.C., destroyed the White House, destroyed Washington, D.C., and that would be a huge event in the history of our nation. And then, for instance, in this hypothetical situation, 10 years from now, we are reading a book about the history of our country or the history of American politics, but it never discussed this destruction of Washington, D.C. Well, what could we most probably infer? Well, that book that we're reading was written before this invasion and the destruction of Washington, D.C. I think that'd be a reasonable assumption. Similarly, then, if the New Testament describes all these important things taking place in Israel and Jerusalem in particular, but never describes this event, the destruction of the temple, which was huge for them, the destruction really of their capital, Jerusalem, then I think a good case can be made that we should assume these narrative books were written before that event took place, because that event is not included in the narrative. So those are just some reasons, big picture reasons, why some people have dated the New Testament books before 100 AD and then even before 70 AD. Now those are big picture reasons, but we can zoom into the details for each of the 27 books and look at the historical evidence for all of them to see if we can more specifically date when they were written. And we're not going to take the time to do that for all 27 of them tonight, obviously. But let's start with just what's often called the narrative books. They're called the narrative books because these are the books of the New Testament that are narrating events, narrating history, so to speak. The rest of the New Testament books are epistles or letters from one person to another person or from one person to a church. But these 5 books, the Gospels and the book of Acts, are narratives. They describe events and they're describing things that happen. So they're more narrative in genre. So these are just some broad outline dates that scholars have come to for the dating of these narrative books. There's obviously a lot of research in this, and you can read more. There's tons of good New Testament scholars out there that are continually researching and looking into these dates to see if they can nail them down more specifically. Because you see, like for the Gospel of Matthew, it's a 20-year time span. We're just not sure when Matthew was written, but New Testament historians and scholars have come to the conclusion that it was written either in the 50s or the 60s. Acts, early 60s, Luke, late 50s, and Mark, probably before Luke, either in the mid to late 50s. Gospel of John, of course, would probably be after AD 70. Most everybody would agree to that. Okay, of all the 27 books in the New Testament, some have stronger historical evidence for them than others. And that's just common sense, right? If you have 27 different ancient documents, some are going to have stronger evidence than others. The books in the New Testament that have the most evidence are a handful of Paul's letters. All of them have good, strong historical evidence, but there's a handful of Paul's letters. Paul wrote 13 books of the New Testament, but a handful of them just have a tremendous amount of historical evidence for them, which has led virtually all scholars, Christian and non-Christian scholars, to conclude the dates when Paul wrote these particular letters. So the letters I'm referring to are Galatians, written in the late 40s, 1st and 2nd Corinthians in the mid-50s, Romans in the mid to late 50s, and then we also have very good historical evidence from multiple sources, independent sources, that Paul was put to death. Paul was killed. Paul was martyred for his faith in the mid to late 60s. So at the very latest date we could give for all of Paul's letters would be mid to late 60s. But these we have good historical evidence for placing them in this time frame. So this is fairly good. This is fairly early, right? I mean, we're pushing back now fairly close to when Jesus did his ministry and died on the cross and rose again, according to the New Testament. So even if Galatians is at 50, and you want to say Jesus' death in the early 30s, what are we talking there? Less than 20 years, which is fairly good from a historical perspective. Now, if we were a detective, right, evaluating a murder that happened last month, we would have an even shorter time period. But as historians looking back on an event that supposedly happened 2,000 years ago, this is pretty good. This is very, very close. However, we can go back even closer. And this is really exciting. I want to tell you the story of how historians and New Testament scholars discovered pre-New Testament material. In other words, material that was written before the New Testament. And there's a sense where we can get closer and closer in time to see, again, the question is here, what the disciples were claiming about Jesus, as close as possible we can get in history to when Jesus lived. Now, I'll tell you this story. It's really exciting. It was discovered by liberal, if you will, non-Christian scholars. So these non-Christian scholars were trying to get back to the real, as they saw it, the real Jesus of history. Because they assumed, and this was a common theory for a long time, that the real Jesus of history never claimed to be God, never did these miracles, he just taught good moral things. And so these scholars had in mind that if they pushed, using their historical methods, pushing back into history to get as close to the historical Jesus as possible, that's what they would find. And so through their historical method, what they discovered were these very early pre-New Testament Christian creeds. Now you probably know what a creed is. You can think of like the Apostles' Creed. A creed is just any religion or belief system has a short, usually pithy statement that summarizes their beliefs. So many of you, maybe even in church, recite the Apostles' Creed. And that's what a creed is, just a short, usually it's easy to memorize, and it summarizes the key beliefs of your particular belief system or religion, right? Well, they found these early Christian creeds by pushing back into history with their historical method. And what do you think that these creeds said? Do you think that these creeds described this Jesus of history as just a good moral teacher that never claimed to be God or do miracles? No, in fact, just the opposite. So these creeds have been dated now by New Testament scholars and historians back to the 30s. So we're talking just a few years after Jesus' ministries, these creeds have been dated. 41 of these creeds. So what do these creeds say? Let's look at the most famous of these creeds. I'll read it for you. It says, "For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance." And then here's the creed. So somebody is taking it and they're passing it on to another group of people, right? He learned this creed, now he's passing it on to others. And here's where the creed begins. That Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter, then to the 12, the disciples. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Now, this is the most famous of the creeds, of course, and you might recognize it. It is found in 1 Corinthians 15. So yes, these creeds are found in the New Testament, but they're quotes. So think about that for a moment. Just like what we said about the church fathers earlier, if the New Testament is quoting these creeds, what must that mean? Well, it must mean that these creeds already existed before the New Testament was written for them to be able to be quoted by the New Testament authors. So it's exciting because in this sense, historians and New Testament scholars, we can be thankful for their work. They discovered pre-New Testament material. Now, these creeds and other discoveries, of course, have led the vast majority of scholars to conclude that the claims of Jesus' miracles and his resurrection were being made very, very early. In fact, consider this quote from, this is an atheist, so a non-Christian New Testament scholar, German scholar, Gerd Ludemann. Look at this quote from him. Based on these creeds and other things, Ludemann says, from historical analysis, we know that the disciples were proclaiming Jesus' resurrection no later than 2 years after the cross. Now, from a historical standpoint, this is remarkable to have these claims being made and us having a record of them so close to when the actual events took place. This is rather remarkable. Now, of course, he, as a non-Christian, doesn't believe these claims that were made by the early Christian disciples, but he agrees that they made the claims very early and would affirm that they believed in what they saw. He just doesn't think, Gerd Ludemann doesn't think Jesus really rose from the dead, but he acknowledges that these early disciples did believe that and proclaimed it very early after the event. So we know from historical analysis that this wasn't a legend that developed, decades or even hundreds of years later. I mean, that theory is completely blown out of the water by this sort of scholarship. Now, this doesn't obviously necessarily mean that they were telling the truth, because you can lie the next day, right? The point I'm making is, all else being equal, the earlier in time that you're making these claims about an event, the more likely that they're true. Just like we talked about with George Washington and George Bush. It's easier to make up lies or legends about somebody or something that happened decades later. But when you're doing it just a couple years later, that's more difficult, because there's eyewitnesses still around who can disprove you and debunk you if you're making up lies. So all else equal, the sooner the claim is being made, the more likely that it's true. Let's move on to number 2. Their testimonies, another good reason to believe that they were telling the truth, is that their testimonies include many, many accurate historical facts. It's important to remember that the New Testament isn't just one ancient historical document. Okay? It's actually 27. Sometimes we make the mistake of thinking the New Testament is just one source. No, it's 27 ancient historical sources written by 9 authors. So it's best to think of the New Testament as 9 separate testimonies from 9 independent sources. So there's a sense in which we have 9, not all eyewitnesses, many of them are eyewitnesses, but some of them are clear up front. They're not an eyewitness, but they got their information from eyewitnesses. So we have 9 independent sources. Some of them did claim to be eyewitnesses, though. They seem to recognize the importance of being an eyewitness. John and Peter in particular talk about this. I'll read these verses. The first one is from 1 John. John said, "What was from the beginning, what we have heard, what we have seen with our own eyes, what we have observed and touched with our hands concerning the word of life, Jesus, that life was revealed, and we have seen it, and we testify and declare to you eternal life that was with the Father and then revealed to us." Peter similarly says, "We didn't follow cleverly contrived myths when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. Instead, we were eyewitnesses of his majesty." So some of the New Testament authors, some of the 9 sources, claim to be eyewitnesses, and they recognize the value of an eyewitness testimony. But was there any evidence that they were really there? It's one thing to claim to be an eyewitness, but are there good reasons and evidence to think that they really are eyewitnesses? Let's look into that. This is a method that detectives, lawyers, judges use to try to figure out if somebody really was an eyewitness. They sit down those supposed eyewitnesses and they ask them about details of the crime scene. Details of the crime scene that only somebody who was there would know. So specific details about who else was around, maybe the weather, maybe what was taking place, the color of various things, cars or buildings, things that you had to be there as an eyewitness to know. In fact, you've probably seen this on movies and TVs. Sometimes the police, detectives, they'll put false information about the crime scene in the newspapers so that people who want publicity or want to claim to be an eyewitness, they'll come in claiming to have seen it, but then give some of the details, the incorrect details that the police officers put in the newspaper, and then they'll know that there really weren't eyewitnesses, that they were getting their information from the newspaper and not from the actual crime scene. So if we apply that sort of strategy, apply that same sort of test to these New Testament authors, do they know details of the history at that time that would be very difficult to know if you weren't really there yourself as an eyewitness? That's the type of test we're going to take the New Testament authors through now. We don't have time to take all 9 of them through that again, so we're going to concentrate on just one, and we're going to focus on Luke. Now, Luke is one of those who is up front and says he wasn't an eyewitness for Jesus' ministry. Okay, so the Gospel of Luke, he says at the very beginning, and we'll see this here after a bit, but Luke says at the beginning that he didn't see these things, but to get his information and to compile his account, the Gospel of Luke, he did historical investigative research and interviewed eyewitnesses. But then part of Acts, which Luke also wrote, he was an eyewitness to. So this is where we can really take Luke and put him under the spotlight, so to speak, and grill him and interview him and see if he knows details that only an eyewitness would know from this book of Acts, that he claims to have been there for these particular events. Now Luke, just so you know a little bit about him, his background and history and such, he was one of the most educated writers of the New Testament, possibly a doctor. He wrote, as I said, Luke and Acts, and was an eyewitness for much of the book of Acts, but not an eyewitness for anything he wrote in Luke. He was a very detailed writer, and historians and New Testament scholars really appreciate Luke's writing because he includes, as we'll see, a lot of good historical facts, which then gives him credibility as a trustworthy historian, trustworthy author, so to speak. The book of Acts is just chock full of historically accurate information. In fact, one New Testament scholar, I appreciate his work, Colin Hemmer, he listed out 84 historical facts that are found in the book of Acts, which we know are accurate from other non-biblical sources, just secular, historical, ancient sources. So the book of Acts, it's a narrative book, recording events that took place and the travels of the different apostles through the Western world, really, at that time. And so he records a lot of these traveling excursions, these mission trips, and does a great job as a historian recording names and places and dates. And so it becomes very, very helpful for us to track him and his account and verify it with other historical sources. Now, these 84 accurate facts in the book of Acts would be very difficult to know if a person wasn't there themselves. Let me just give you a flavor of what these facts are. These 84 facts include the names of obscure local authorities, obscure local politicians and their appropriate titles, precise geography and travel routes that they took and people took back then, local weather patterns, unusual cultural and business practices, customs, and even slang words from the different locations that they would travel to. And again, all these 84 facts have been proven accurate from other ancient historical sources. Now back then, obviously, they didn't have the internet or Google to search these things and to know these things. So if you weren't there yourself, it would be very difficult for somebody who wasn't an eyewitness to write about these things and include these type of details accurately. Let me just give you one example. We have so much to cover tonight, but I recommend this as a resource. The Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History by Colin J. Hemmer. Good resource to have. But we'll just look at one example. So we know from two ancient Roman historians, Suetonius, who was the chief secretary for the emperor, and another historian, ancient historian, Cassius Dio, we know from those two sources that the Emperor Claudius kicked the Jews out of Rome. We just know that that happened as a historical event. And lo and behold, what do we see in the book of Acts? In Acts 18, Luke records this. After this, he's just documenting the travels of Paul at this point. After this, he, Paul, left Athens and went to Corinth, where he found a Jewish man named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Emperor Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. Now, Luke didn't really have a particular reason to include that historical fact, but he's just narrating what happened during Paul's travels and includes this tidbit of history, which has been confirmed by other historical sources. So it just helps provide Luke that sort of credibility as a trustworthy source. Of course, then, as we establish Luke's credibility through the book of Acts, then that credibility carries over to the other book he wrote in the New Testament, which is the Gospel of Luke. Look how he explained his writing process when he penned this book, the Gospel of Luke. Luke says, "Many have undertaken to compile a narrative about the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as the original eyewitnesses and servants of the word handed them down to us. It also seemed good to me, since I have carefully investigated everything from the very first, to write to you in an orderly sequence, most honorable Theophilus." So he's writing his account. Look how he describes it. He's writing a narrative of history and investigating it to make sure that this is what really happened. So he's documenting his research, so to speak. And it's clear he's not intending for his readers to think that he's writing a myth, okay? If we're really trying to get into the intention of the author, which is what we try to do when we do interpretation, right? We try to understand what an author was trying to communicate, what they were intending to mean. It clearly doesn't seem that Luke is intending to communicate to his readers that he's inventing a legend, right? Or that he's making up a story or a myth. He says, no, look, I've carefully investigated this. You've heard from eyewitnesses. I've investigated eyewitnesses. I'm writing down in a very careful way what actually happened. At least that's what he's trying to communicate. Look how when he gets to chapter 3, look at how he starts off the narrative, right? This is how he starts it off. "In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod, tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip, tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias, tetrarch of Abilene, during the high priesthood of Annas and Sapphira, the word of God came to John, son of Zechariah, in the desert." Now, just reading that, does it seem like it's the author's intention to be inventing a story or telling what actually happened in history? It doesn't start off like a Star Wars movie, right? It doesn't start off, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, or once upon a time. No, think about what he's doing. He's noting the exact year that this happened. They didn't use years like we do, of course, now. If we would do it nowadays, we would say this would be AD 29. But for him, he places it exactly in a year by referring to the reign, and this is what was done oftentimes in the ancient world. Somebody really famous, and the year of their reign is when a particular event happened, if you want to date it accurately. He lists 8, count them, 8 well-known people from history, and notes that these people lived during this time, which we know he's correct from other historical sources. He also describes the positions that he held, again, which we know are correct from other ancient historical sources. So it just doesn't seem like he's intending to be telling a made-up story here. He's placing the events very carefully in history by referring to these other historical people. In fact, I'll give you a list here real quick. There are 30 known persons from history in the New Testament. Now just think about that for a moment. Some of them don't play, a very major role. They're just referenced, but some of them do play a pretty major role. And think about that for a moment. If you are trying to tell a bunch of lies, if you're trying to make a myth, trying to write a legend that's not true, why would you include so many well-known, famous people, really, from history? If you didn't have to. I mean, if you just want to make up a story, it would be better not to include all these people in your account and just talk about people that nobody knows. And then it'd be more easy to lie. But once you start bringing in these big names from history, it would be more difficult to lie about them because they're so well known from other sources. So again, just going back to Luke's accurate recording of history gives him a lot of credibility. So, because it gives him so much credibility then, we're more willing to believe him when he talks about things such as miracles. If he's established himself as a faithful historian with just, if you will, normal details, names, dates, times, then he seems to be much more trustworthy then, more likely to be believable when he records other things, such as miracles. It's kind of like, go back to the courtroom scene again. If you establish that a witness is trustworthy, if you establish that an eyewitness, a supposed eyewitness, knew the events of the crime scene, that they're trustworthy, they're credible, that they're accurate, then you're more likely to believe them when they talk about the actual murder that took place, the event that we're focusing on. And in this case, we're more likely to believe Luke then because he's shown himself to be very accurate and credible when he talks about the events we're focusing on, Jesus' miracles and his resurrection. Well, we got to move on. Got a lot to cover tonight, so let's move on to number 3. The third good reason to believe that the New Testament authors told the truth is that their testimonies are confirmed by non-Christian historical sources. Now, I love this one. This one's really exciting to me. When I was first into apologetics, I thought this was the field I was going to specialize in before I got introduced to philosophy and fell in love with that side of apologetics. But this still really, really fascinates me. What we're looking at here is archaeology and ancient historians. So, in other words, external evidence to the New Testament. What do these external sources say about the main events of the New Testament? We'll start with archaeology. Some have questioned, for a time, some questioned whether Pontius Pilate was even a real historical person. Again, part of this theory was that the disciples were just making up this myth and they needed a bad guy that condemned Jesus, and so they just invented this Pontius Pilate guy. At least that was a theory that was put out. Pontius Pilate wasn't a real historical person. He was just part of the myth. However, that idea was completely blown out of the water, so to speak, in 1961 when the Pilate stone was discovered. It was discovered at Caesarea Maritima in Israel and dated by archaeologists to be from the late 20s or the 30s AD. It's a Latin inscription. It reads Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. So archaeological evidence that, without a doubt, makes it clear that Pontius Pilate was a real historical person. In fact, I would encourage you, there's a really neat historical fiction book about Pontius Pilate written by Paul Meyer. We talked about Paul Meyer last week. He was the ancient professor of history at Western Michigan University, and he wrote a historical fiction book. So it takes as much history that we know and have about Pontius Pilate, but then he adds in some fiction to try to give a fuller account of what actually happened to Pilate after Jesus died on the cross. And we have some pretty good historical sources for Pilate's life now, even after this discovery. There's even some evidence that Pilate himself became a Christian. Not, conclusive evidence, but he's included as a hero of the faith in the Eastern Orthodox religion. They veneer him as a saint, I believe, even. So that book, Pontius Pilate, that historical fiction book, is very enjoyable by Paul Meyer. Another archaeological discovery that's really exciting, we may actually have the bones of Caiaphas. Now, Caiaphas was the high priest that sentenced Jesus to death. Okay, so he was the Jewish leader, and then Pontius Pilate was the Roman leader, of course. This was discovered in 1990, and it's his bone box. For a brief period of time, Jews would, after somebody died and was buried, then after so much time elapsed, they would dig up the bones and put them in this bone box for the long term. It's called the ossuary. Now, we're not entirely sure this is Caiaphas, the high priest, but there's good evidence that this is actually the bones of Caiaphas, the high priest that sentenced Jesus to die. Another archaeological discovery that was really exciting, some had claimed that the New Testament couldn't be true. The story of Jesus dying on the cross couldn't be true because crucifixion just didn't happen in the first century in Jerusalem. So if there wasn't crucifixion even being practiced at that time in that area, then of course the New Testament then couldn't be correct. It must be a myth. But that theory was completely blown out of the water in 1968 when archaeologists found the bones of a man named Jehohanan who was crucified in Jerusalem in the first century. So we actually have bones of somebody who was crucified in the first century in Jerusalem, proving that that practice was taking place at that time, at that place. Now, this discovery is fascinating, and I encourage you to look more into it online if you're interested in these sort of things. But from just the evidence of this man's bones, we can see that both of his feet had been nailed together to the cross that he was crucified on. His legs were bent to one side. His arm bones had scratches where the nails passed through. Both legs had been badly fractured from a crushing blow that was meant to bring on death more quickly in the crucifixion practice. So again, archaeological proof that the crucifixion was happening in Jerusalem in the first century. Let's move on. There's a lot more archaeological discoveries, but you can do that sort of research. Maybe that's something you'd like to write a paper on for this class. But let's look now at non-Christian written sources. These would be external, extra-biblical, sometimes they're called, sources that confirm the events, the major events that took place in the New Testament. There's actually 10 of these. So 10 ancient, non-Christian sources that mention Jesus within 150 years of his life. So we've got historians that talk about Jesus and the early disciples. We've got government officials, and then we've got the Jewish Talmud and a Greek writer named Lucian. So 10 ancient sources from non-Christians that discuss some of the events recorded in the New Testament. Now, this is pretty incredible when you consider that we only have 9 non-Christian sources that refer to Tiberius Caesar. So there's a sense in which there's more historical sources, more historical evidence, if you will, for Jesus than there is Tiberius Caesar, one of the most famous people in history. Okay, let's just look at 2 of them that I have here on the list, Tacitus and Josephus. So Tacitus, tell you a little bit more about him. He was a Roman senator and a historian, lived from 56 to 117, and this is what he wrote. Okay, not a Christian, but just recording history as part of his job. He said that Jesus suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of Pontius Pilatus, the Latin spelling of it, and a most mischievous superstition broke out not only in Judea, but even in Rome. Now, he doesn't elaborate what this mischievous superstition was, but it sounds a lot like, the beliefs of the early disciples, their religious beliefs that they were proclaiming, broke out and grew and spread even to Rome. It describes kind of what happened in the book of Acts. The story and the beliefs of Christianity spread rapidly all around the known world. Let's look at another one, Josephus. Now, Josephus was the court historian for the Emperor Domitian. Lived from 38 to 97, so first century source. And some versions, it's important to note, there are some versions, all of these sources have to go through textual criticism, just like the New Testament does. All ancient documents have to be reconstructed from copies, right? We talked about that. So even these works of Josephus and Tacitus have to be reconstructed from copies. And there are some copies of Josephus's work where a Christian editor had made some additional notes. But by comparing different copies, textual critics have been able to get back with a fairly high degree of accuracy to what Josephus originally wrote by comparing these copies and taking out all the things that were inserted later by a Christian copier, right? It seems, as best we can tell, this Christian copier was just adding some details off to the side. But if we get back, which historians think we can very accurately, to what Josephus originally said, this is that version of it. So Josephus wrote, "At this time there was a wise man called Jesus. His conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. Many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. But his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion, that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets had recounted wonders." So, external, non-biblical, non-Christian source for some of the major events recorded in the New Testament. This corroboration is very important to historians when they're looking at this. Let's do a neat experiment. I find this to be just absolutely fascinating. What if we didn't have the New Testament? What if all we had were these 10 non-Christian sources? Just from these 10 non-Christian sources, what could we know about Jesus? If, for instance, we didn't even have the New Testament. If we could compile all the data from these 10 non-Christian sources, what would we have? Take a look at this. I find this rather amazing. Well, we would know that Jesus lived during the time of Tiberius Caesar. We would know he lived a virtuous life. We would know his disciples believed he performed miracles, that he had a brother named James, that his disciples believed he was the Messiah, that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. Get this, an eclipse and an earthquake occurred when he died. We know that from extra-biblical sources. He was crucified on the eve of the Passover. Disciples believed he rose from the dead. Disciples were willing to die for their beliefs. We know that from extra-biblical sources. Christianity spread very rapidly, even as far as Rome. And these early disciples of Jesus rejected the Roman gods, but they worshipped Jesus as their God. Which is pretty much what the New Testament says. I mean, that's pretty much just a summary of the New Testament. And that's all from non-biblical sources, which provide that historical corroboration to the New Testament, so it gives us more reason to believe that they were really telling the truth. Let's move on to number 4. The fourth reason to believe that the New Testament authors were telling the truth is that they included details which made themselves look bad. Now we need to think through this for a second, and this is a strategy that's used by detectives, lawyers, judges when they're evaluating possible eyewitnesses. Okay? And just process this with me for a moment. First of all, have you ever told a lie? Of course so. We've all lied. Have you ever told a lie to make yourself look good or to look better than you really are? I know I have. Well, think about this question. Have you ever told a lie to make yourself look bad or to look worse than you really are? That's not usually why we lie, is it? I mean, sometimes if it's like a self-deprecating humor or joke or something, but usually when we lie, it's to make ourselves look good, not to make ourselves look bad. And so lawyers, detectives, judges, they know when they're evaluating somebody's supposed eyewitness testimony, if they describe themselves in ways that's embarrassing, it's more than likely, all else being equal, more likely true. However, if they describe the situation and they look very good, then it causes them to wonder if that's what really happened. Because we all know humans tend to lie to make themselves look better than what they really are. So let's look at the New Testament and see how the authors, the disciples, describe themselves. So I'll ask it this way. Would you lie to make yourself look ignorant or stupid? Because that's how the disciples are often portrayed in the New Testament. Slow, dumb, they just don't get it, dense. Jesus tries to teach them things and they don't understand. They mess up all the time. Just one example here from Luke 18 says the disciples understood none of these things and they did not comprehend the things that were said. Now, again, the theory is that they're just lying, right? And if you're lying, why would you include something like this to make yourself look bad? If you were lying and making up a story, why wouldn't you include things that make you look good? Unless you're just recording what actually happened, then you would include such details. Makes us more likely to believe they were telling the truth, that they include things like this. Ask another question. Would you lie to make yourself look uncaring? I mean, look, in the New Testament, the disciples fall asleep on Jesus twice in one night. They make no effort to give him a proper burial. In fact, somebody from the enemy team, Joseph of Arimathea, has to come and bury Jesus. He was a member of the Sanhedrin, which is rather embarrassing for the disciples. Would you lie to make yourself look criticized? Now think about this like teenagers at school, right? Teenagers lie to their parents when they get in trouble at school or they get bad grades at school. Not the other way around, right? Teenagers don't make up lies about, they don't invent lies about getting bad grades or getting in trouble to tell their parents, right? No, they lie when those things happen. They don't invent those lies to make themselves look bad. But throughout the New Testament, the disciples are often scolded. In fact, Jesus scolded Peter so harshly that he called him Satan. Now remember, Peter was the first leader of the church, right? He was the leader of the disciples, the first leader of the early church. And if you're making up a story, right, if you're just making up a legend or a myth or a lie, you're not going to say these sort of things about your leader, right? You're going to want to make your leader look as good as possible so that people would follow the leader, right? But instead we find Peter being scolded by Jesus very harshly, and then Paul, it's recorded in the New Testament, also scolds Peter for making the wrong decision. Now, what CEO or what leader of what organization would, if they're making up lies, would want to include or make up that sort of lie to make them look bad? No, we lie to make ourselves look good. Well, would you lie to make yourself look cowardly? Because that seems like what the disciples are in the New Testament. When Jesus is arrested, they all flee, they run away. One of them stark naked, right? They look like cowards. Peter, the leader, again, denies Jesus 3 times because he's afraid. The male disciples run away, while the female disciples, the women in the story, are the brave ones. Now this is this is not the type of thing that men do, right? When men make up stories, men are just too prideful. And I know this from experience because I'm one of them, and I'm too prideful. And I would, if I was going to make up the story, right, if I'm just making up a lie, I'm not going to say that I was the coward and the women were the brave ones. If I was making up the story, if men were making up the story, you know what we would say, right? We would say, we marched down to the tomb, we got in those soldiers' faces, and we demanded Jesus' body. Jesus congratulated us for our faith, and then we went home and comforted all the women who were crying and scared at home. If men were making up the story, that's what they would say. So the fact that they portray themselves as the weak, cowardly ones, and the women who went to the tomb, the bold ones, and in fact were the first to see the resurrected Jesus, and in that culture, people would discount the testimony of women. I disagree with that, obviously, and I'm sure you do too, but in that culture, that's what they did. And so if you're trying to lie in that culture, you wouldn't have women being the ones who discovered the empty tomb first. So again, all these things seem to indicate that they were telling the truth, not inventing lies. The last one, would you lie to make yourself look doubtful? In the New Testament, it says that the disciples doubted Jesus' resurrection when they first heard about it. In fact, it records some of them doubting even after they touched Jesus and saw him with their own eyes. They still had doubts. And remember this other theory. This other theory supposedly goes like this, that Jesus or the disciples just made up these things about Jesus and try to convince other people of their lie. Now, if they're doing that, if they're just making these things up, why say that they had doubts? If you're trying to convince somebody of something, you don't talk about your doubts about it. You try to be as bold and confident as possible and say that you know without a shadow of a doubt these things are true and you've always been convinced of them and the evidence was overwhelming. Why would you include the fact that you had doubts about it? Unless that's just what happened. And they're recording, as much as possible, accurate historical information. Okay, let's move on. We got 2 more to go. Number 5. The 5th good reason to believe the New Testament authors told the truth is that the differences between their testimonies are small and reconcilable. Now you hear a lot, I'm sure you have, you've heard a lot about the differences between the Gospels, especially what's called the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, right? There are differences between the Gospels, but this is actually a good thing. It's usually criticized as something that makes their account less believable, but if you evaluate it, it actually makes their account more trustworthy and believable. Again, we're evaluating the situation like lawyers, detectives, judges do, and when they're evaluating testimonies from multiple supposed eyewitnesses, if the differences between these testimonies are too large, then it's a good sign that they're lying. And I'll give you a comical example of this. There was, as the story goes, there were some guys from college who went on spring break. And they went to the beach. They all piled in a car and went to the beach for spring break and had a great time at the beach. They were enjoying themselves. But the week was coming to an end and they had to get back to class because Monday morning, they had to get back to school because Monday morning in one of their classes they had a test. So they're getting to the end of the spring break week and they're having such a great time they want to stay one more day. They know they've got to leave soon to get back to class Monday morning to take that test, but they say, look, let's invent a lie. Let's come up with a story that, hey, we got a flat tire. Well, what could we do? We'll just have to, we'll enjoy one more day at the beach. We'll get home a day late and just tell the professor that we got a flat tire on the way home. And what could we have done? We wanted to be here to take your test, but we got a flat tire. Is there any way that you would let us take the test the next day, Tuesday? So all thought it was a great idea. That's what they did. Came to the professor's office the next day, Tuesday, told their big lie, and the professor, just like they thought, said, no problem. Things happen, so I'll let you take the test now. And the professor puts all four of the guys then in separate rooms, and they're so excited they think they've pulled it off. But they all four open simultaneously their exam, and the first question on the exam from the professor is, which tire went flat? So the professor caught them, because their difference is going to be too large, and when there's too large of differences between testimonies, then we know they're most likely lying, most likely not telling the truth. That's pretty obvious. I think that makes sense. But what I find rather interesting is that lawyers, detectives, judges, they also say that if there's no differences between the testimonies from the supposed different eyewitnesses, in other words, if the stories are exactly the same adverbs and adjectives are used, the same order of events precisely, then that keys them in to the fact that they're most likely telling a lie. Why would that be the case? Well, if there's no differences between the stories, then most likely it's collusion. Most likely they got together ahead of time and agreed to tell the same story, and that would mean it's not true. So what lawyers, detectives, judges in a courtroom environment like this, or an investigation, what they actually look for is important differences between the accounts. Small differences and reconcilable differences. Small, not major things, right? Small differences. And differences that can be reconciled. Because we all see things from different vantage points, right? Different angles, different interests. We look for different details. If an engineer is going to look for different details than maybe an artist would, or they would describe their account differently, an artist versus an engineer. So our stories are going to be a little bit different. But if there's small reconcilable differences, it's a good sign that they're telling the truth. Critics of the New Testament make too big a deal of the differences between the Gospels. So let's do this. I think this is very useful. Let's apply the critics of the New Testament. Let's take their type of criticisms of these differences between the Gospels. Let's take their types of critiques and apply them to a recent news story. So you might have heard recently about this ship that got jammed in the Suez Canal, right? And this was reported on by many different news agencies. So here we have a case of multiple accounts, multiple testimonies, if you will, from different sources, and let's see how they describe this event. And we'll apply the same sort of critiques to these different accounts that these New Testament critics apply to the Gospels. So, look at these differences. The New York Times said the ship was Japanese-owned. The Associated Press, the AP, said that the ship was Panama-flagged. And ships usually fly the flag of the country from where the owner is from, right? So this seems like a contradiction. Reuters said that the ship was owned by a company. So should we reject this story as a lie then? Because it has these contradictory things in it? What about this? What caused the ship to get stuck? Associated Press said that the vessel ran aground due to strong winds. whereas the New York Times said that the wind could have been a factor, but human error may have come into play. Reuters said that it got wedged into the canal during a sandstorm. The other two didn't mention a storm at all. So can we believe this story with these sort of contradictions? They report different numbers. The New York Times said that 18,840 ships passed through the Suez Canal in 2020, whereas the Associated Press said that 19,000 ships passed through the canal last year. So should we reject this as a lie because it's different? What did the ship get stuck in? New York Times said the ship ran aground on a sandbank, whereas the Associated Press said they was stuck in clay. A contradiction. Are we being lied to by the media? Some of them include details that the others don't. For instance, the New York Times said that the ship towered over Ghafar's dusty brick house, whereas the Associated Press and Reuters didn't mention Ghafar or any house. And I don't see any houses in that picture. So did the New York Times just make up this Ghafar person? Does Ghafar even really exist? These are the sort of critiques that New Testament critics apply to the Gospels when they see similar differences between those accounts. So, with this story, should we conclude then that this event really didn't happen? That we're being lied to by the media? Well, of course not. Reporting is selective, right? People report different things from different vantage points. So let's go through this story, and you can do this with any news story. It's rather fun, actually. Let's just go back through all these details and see how these differences are, first, small differences, and secondly, how they can be reconciled. So, even though I don't know for sure, maybe it's the case that the ship is owned by a Japanese company, but it was registered for whatever reason in Panama. It's possible. Maybe it was a combination of winds, a sandstorm, and human error. And so if they reported different factors, maybe it was a combination of all three. The third point to make is that it's not a contradiction, it's not a lie, and it's not an error to round numbers. Okay? A lot of times people make a big deal about difference in numbers between books of the Bible. But it's not an error, a lie, or a contradiction to round numbers. We always do that. So you can't make too big a deal of these sort of differences. What did it run into? Sand or clay? Well, maybe it was sandy clay. I don't know. A mixture of sand and clay. You can, even if the point is, you don't even have to know how the two things can be reconciled, but you can just use a little common sense and think of how the details could be reconciled, and then conclude that they're not necessarily lying, right? They're just reporting different details. And lastly, it's not a contradiction, a lie, or an error to include a detail that another account didn't include. So, example, one gospel talks about being two angels being at the empty tomb, where one only talks and describes one angel. Well, is that a contradiction then? Well, no, one of them just talked about one of the angels that were there, and one of them talked about two of the angels that were there. Maybe there were three there. It's not an error to leave some details out, just like it wasn't an error for some of these news agencies to leave out Ghafar and his house. So not all differences are contradictions. All of these examples that we looked at with this story are examples of small reconcilable differences. And these are the exact type of differences that we see in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. For the sake of time, we'll just look at one example of this, and that is the sign above the cross. A lot of people don't realize that according to the New Testament, there was a sign placed above the cross when Jesus died. However, the four Gospels all say that something different was written on this sign. Contradiction? Can't trust the account? Not necessarily. I think too big of a deal has been made out of these sort of differences. Because this, for instance, is a small difference, and it can be very, very easily reconciled. How? Well, it's quite possible that this is what the sign said. This is Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews, and that each of the gospel writers just included a different portion of the entire sentence. Almost the exact type of thing that we saw with the Suez Canal ship, right? Another possible reconciliation is that it was a multilingual culture, just like ours is in America. A lot of our signs say things in English and Spanish, and it would make sense for this sign to be written in multiple languages, right? And so maybe they were quoting what was written a little bit differently in the different languages. But it's all getting at the same root meaning or the same root idea of what was on that sign. So it's these sort of small reconcilable differences that we see between the New Testament accounts. As I said, even if we don't know exactly how to reconcile it, it's a huge leap from going from noticing these details or noticing these differences to concluding it must be a lie. As I said before, I think it's sufficient just to use some common sense and come up with a possible reconciliation, even if we don't know the actual reconciliation. Now, I should clarify, at this point in the class, I'm not claiming that the Bible has no errors. I'm not claiming that the Bible has no mistakes. I haven't made that argument and I haven't made that claim yet. We're going to get to the point in the class, as I'm providing an overall case for Christianity, where I will argue that there are no mistakes or errors in the Bible. But for now, that's not the point we're making. The only point we're making is that the New Testament is historically reliable about the basic major events that it describes: Jesus' teaching, his miracles, and his resurrection. So even if some ancient documents or some historical sources or some eyewitness testimonies had forgotten things or messed up on some of the details, it doesn't necessarily mean their account should be completely thrown out. If the differences are large, of course, they would be, or if they made huge major mistakes, they should be thrown out. But you wouldn't discount an eyewitness testimony if they made some minor mistakes. As we said before, it's human to err. So we forget things after so much time, right? But it still could mean that their accounts are historically reliable, even if they mess up on remembering what was on the sign. So those sort of details, even if they are inaccurate, which I don't believe they are, and I'll make a case that there are no mistakes in the Bible, but even if there are some small mistakes, it doesn't mean their accounts are not historically reliable. So, to that point, let's say that there actually are some contradictions between Luke and Mark, some real contradictions that aren't small, not reconcilable, that there are some actual small contradictions. That wouldn't necessarily prove that the Gospels are not historically reliable. Now, I'm going to make the case that there aren't any mistakes or contradictions later in the class, but even if we would allow for those things, that wouldn't necessarily mean their entire account is false if they got some minor details wrong. I'll give you a silly example of that, right? So like the eyewitnesses who saw the Titanic sink, right? Some of the eyewitnesses said that the entire ship sank together. It sank in one piece. Other eyewitnesses say that the ship broke apart and the two pieces sank separately. So we have a divergence between the eyewitness accounts. Obviously, one side is right and one side is wrong, but even if some of them did record things incorrectly, does that mean we shouldn't believe that the Titanic actually sunk? No. So my point I'm getting at here is that even if there are some mistakes, and I don't think there are, but even if there are some mistakes or contradictions in the Gospels, it doesn't mean we should or have to throw out the entire account as historically unreliable. Okay, let's move on to number 6, our last one here. The 6th reason to believe that the New Testament authors told the truth. And I'm starting it off with this picture. So ask the question, think through this question. What does this tell us about the religious beliefs of those flying the planes into the Twin Towers on 9/11? What does it tell us about the religious beliefs of those men flying the planes? Well, it doesn't tell us that their beliefs are true, but it does tell us that they believed their religious beliefs were true. And I trust you see the distinction there. Yes, people die for false beliefs. That happens all the time. But people don't die for beliefs that they know are false. And the New Testament authors were in a position to know whether their claims were true or false, because if they were false, they were the ones who came up with the lie. They were the ones who invented the lie. So they were in a position to know if their testimonies were true or not. And people don't die for things that they know are false. If somebody's willing to die for something, then that doesn't tell you that their beliefs are true, but it tells you that they believe that their beliefs are true. And the New Testament authors were in a unique place to know if their beliefs were true or not, because if they were false, they were the ones who invented the lies. So the fact that they were willing to die for their testimonies gives us a very good reason to believe that they were telling the truth. In fact, it's hard to come up with any ulterior motives here. It's hard to even come up with any motivations for why they would come up with this lie, starting a new religion. Now, I mean, nowadays, especially in America, you can get rich and famous by starting a new religion. You know, you get a bunch of followers and get a lot of publicity, and you get rich and famous for being a religious leader, starting a new religion here nowadays. But in their context, that wasn't the case at all, right? I mean, they didn't get rich and famous by starting a new religion. In fact, they got the opposite. For them, it just brought ridicule, rejection, financial ruin, persecution, suffering, torture, and a very painful death. That's not quite motivation enough to lie, to get those sort of things. So the fact that they were willing to die for their beliefs tells us that they believed their beliefs were true. And they were in a position, unlike those who flew the planes into the Twin Towers, they were in a position to know if their beliefs were true or not, because if they were false, they were the ones who made up the lies. So if you want to study into the historical evidence for the martyrdom of the early Christian disciples, this would be a good resource for you. This is by Sean McDowell, The Fate of the Apostles, and he walks through all the historical evidence we have for how the apostles died for their faith. And here's just a summary of some of those sources. You think about it for just a moment. You know, the disciples were radically transformed from these cowards, right, hiding and scared. They were radically transformed from cowards to these brave martyrs of the faith. And what's the best explanation of that? What's the best explanation for that transformation? Is it best explained by them coming up with a bunch of lies? It's hard to fathom how just coming up with a bunch of lies would give them boldness and that they would be willing to die for. What seems to me a much more reasonable explanation is that they really saw Jesus' resurrected body, and that's what transformed them from being cowards to these bold leaders willing to die, be martyrs for what they believed in. Now, I will say, just for a minute here, as we close. We've gone through these 6 reasons now, and let me say it this way. It's very, very easy to come up with alternate theories, right? Kind of like conspiracy theories. It's so easy to come up with a conspiracy theory. What I'm referring to is like Da Vinci Code type theories. Oh, Jesus actually married Mary Magdalene and had a child, and now there's this royal divine bloodline. Or maybe Jesus was an alien from outer space. Or, there's just an endless amount of what ifs. Or is it possible that X, Y, Z happened? Well, of course it's possible, but possibilities are endless, right? You've heard me use the analogy many times of hearing a knock at the door, and think of all the possibilities that knock could be. It could be a giraffe, it could be a kangaroo, it could be an alien from outer space. All sorts of possibilities behind that knock, but what's the most reasonable explanation? Let's look at the evidence, right? So when somebody gives me a possibility, or they ask me a question like, isn't it possible that X, Y, Z could have happened instead? I say, of course it's possible. I'll give you that possibility. But do you have any eyewitness testimony? Do you have any first century documentation from non-Christian sources? Where's your evidence for your theory? Okay, it's easy to throw out conspiracies, it's easy to throw out possibilities, but you got to back them up. That's what we're trying to do here tonight. We're trying to back up our beliefs, give reasons and evidence why we believe X, Y, Z. So if you want to throw out an alternative, feel free to do so, but back it up. Do you have eyewitness testimony? Do you have 9 independent sources that are backed up then by other first century historical ancient documents? So give us your evidence for your theory. One of the classic examples is like the Quran, right? So the Quran, according to Muhammad, Jesus was just a prophet. He never claimed to be God and never died on the cross. But again, I would just ask, respectfully, in love, ask a Muslim, what's your historical evidence for that? Do you have any first century eyewitness testimony to believe that your account? They don't. Instead what they have is a supposed prophet who got this information about Jesus in a cave 600 years after Jesus' ministry. Whereas we, as Christians, have first century data that goes back, those creeds, even to a couple years after Jesus' ministry, multiple eyewitness sources that affirm and that their different accounts have these small reconcilable differences. We have all sorts of reasons to believe our account, and you compare that to somebody in a cave supposedly being told by an angel 600 years later a different account. Well, just measure, the historical credibility of those two accounts. What has the stronger evidence behind them? So here's where we're going next. We did tonight reasons to believe the New Testament authors told the truth, and this works back up importantly because it's his miracles that are the best case to believe that he is God in the flesh. What we're going to do next week, though, is we're going to see there's several other reasons besides his miracles to believe that Jesus was God. I think the miracles are the most important, the most powerful, compelling case, the most powerful reason to believe he was God, but we're going to see several of them next week. So let's look at the class schedule. Those of you taking it through Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, you guys are the only ones that this applies to. Anybody else watching it can just shut off the video at this point. But tonight's April 1st, so what you have due tonight then is in Frank Turek's book, chapter 9 and 10, and then appendix 3, and then in chapter 5 for J.P. Moreland's book. Those reading summaries are due to me by midnight tonight, April 1st. So next week then is going to be April 8th, of course, and just 2 chapters. I want you to start thinking through your papers, so I'm giving you less and less reading. But for next week then, read chapter 11 in Frank Turek's book, and chapter 6 in J.P. Moreland's book, Love Your God with All Your Mind. As always, if you guys have questions or if you're thinking about topics for your paper and you're unsure about them, feel free to shoot me a message and I can try to help you out with that or anything else that has to do with this class, the logistics, or the material. I'm here to serve.